Testing, testing. Okay. So, hi. Welcome back to another reading of Straight On Till Morning, a Twisted Disney reading of, well, yeah, Straight On Till Morning. a twisted, a twisted tale of what if Wendy had traveled to Neverland at first with Captain Hook instead of Peter Pan. So I know it's been a whole month since I did a live stream. But anyway, I do remember where we left off, where I left off at. Uh, Wendy had successfully escaped from Captain Hook's ship with the help of someone on that ship. She found her home that she made up in Neverland, as well as her pet wolf. And then she decided to seek out Peter Pan within Neverland. She discovered that her brothers had influence in Neverland if they felt some type of way or anything, if they uh, made up something for Neverland. She discovered the hard way that those things can come true and not just you know, not just her tellings, okay? Not just her tellings of what goes on in Neverland, like her little stories of Neverland. No, if they felt some type of way, things they come true. So Wendy almost got killed by her little brother, Michael's um imaginary little crystal boy that will kill adults for trying to enter Neverland. And yeah, because Wendy is of that age, she's considered an adult and was almost killed by a crystallized version of her little brother. So we're back in it again. Finish off chapter 11. Now we're going in to we finished off with chapter 10. Now we're going in to chapter 11. Okay, so meanwhile, on the high seas, Captain Hook paced back and forth in his cabin, predatorily, but not like, but not at all like a wolf. More like a military commander with a motive, and possibly a bad back. The angry movements and swishing clothes made the captain's quarters seem even tighter than they already were. He filled the space with his plumes, red jackets, and frustration. There was room for nothing else besides his rage. When he was interrupted, rarely, the interrupting pirate stayed outside, unable or unwilling to come in. Talk, bloody talk, and this will be all over. Hook swore at his prisoner. Just tell me where Peter Pan is. Once I have him, you can go. Pan's shadows thrive. But, but too early in the morning for me to get tongue tied. Pan's shadow writhed and shrank before the captain, but didn't answer. Its lower body was cinched tight with a silken cord, only a little string of shadows sticking out at the bottom of the knots, possibly its toe. The rest puffed up and out like a dark genie out of a bottle, though its arms were also stretched and tied. It squirmed and distended itself pitifully in an attempt to get free. All the usual sorts of torture had little effect on the thing. Discarded implements were strewn around the floor as a testament to their uselessness. Knives, pincers, hot brands, tacks through the nails, fingernails thrown across slate boards. He had a drunk Smee playing the what the heck is that? Concertia? But the terrible music had no effect on the shadow at all. It did, however, make the captain want to put his own ears out with his hook. The shadow has some presence in the real world. Otherwise, the cord wouldn't have held at all. But the rules that govern it were tricky, and, well, Hook wasn't the most logical and thorough practitioner of the scientific method. He grew frustrated often, and tantrums came quick. The captain stewed, rage boiling up quietly behind his eyes and face again. And then, in the silence of this latest lull, a quiet ticking began, distant and weak. Hook's prodigy. Too early in the morning. Too early in the morning. Hook's prodigious brows shot up to the top of his forehead. He dashed out of the cabin, throwing papers and chairs aside, and ran to the railing, nearly knocking a pirate overboard along the way. Tick, tick, tick. He started to let out a sigh of relief, just some of the rigging snapping against the mast or tuck. What passed for Hook's heart almost stopped, clenched in an invisible icy fist. He staggered away from the railing, hands over his ears so he couldn't hear it anymore. Tick, tock, tick, tock. No, 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 not now. It's all coming together, he cried, rushing up and down the deck in a panic. I was practically handed Peter's shadow, and once I used it to get to Peter, I could blow everything the boy loves to smithereens while he watched. It's the greatest revenge ever planned by any villain ever, and I was almost there. He ran back to the comforting darkness of his cabin and threw the door violently shut behind him. We are running out of time here, he screeched at the shadow. I am running out of time. Can you hear that? The vile crook. Come for me. So talk, blast you. Maybe it can't talk, Smee suggested from the corner of the room, where he had waited quietly until the captain's fit had passed. Of course it can't talk, Hook swore, raising his eyebrows at his first mate's predictable stupidity. It's a shadow. But it could make a sign or write something. I gave it the bloody slate before I made those dismal noises. It didn't even bother to try. Maybe it can't write. Maybe Peter Pan can't write. Can he read? Smee said curiously. Never seen a lad with a book or nothing. Why, that's... Hook paused, thinking. Actually, that's a very good point, Mr. Smee. A sadly ignorant Peter Pan can't even write his own name. Uneducated lout. So maybe he's not worth your time, Mr. Smee hazarded. Such a useless, adventurous, young, enthusiastic, utterly uneducated boy. A right simpleton. Not much of a nemesis, right? Maybe you should just forget about him like the crew's been suggesting. Forget all about Neverland. Just put it behind you. Let's go out and find us a merchant vessel or pillage a seaside town. Right now, like in the good old days. I won't let Peter get away. I won't let him escape me this time. The captain, it's a never-ending chase, Mr. Smee pointed out as gently as a mother consoling a child chasing his own shadow. Well, sometimes it seems like you get the best of him, but he always gets the best of you in the end. And then he slips away. Maybe it's time to let it go. Like, move on. Wrap up that part of your life and enjoy what's enjoyable now. The sea, the sun, the blood of your enemies. But, but I want him, Hook whispered, lips trembling. He always gets away from me, and it's not fair. He took my hand. He took the best part. He took the best of me. Ma, Mr. Smee said, patting him on the back. Not the best of you. Your hook is so useful, ain't it? And shiny. He didn't take away nothing. He gave you a deadly weapon and a buttload of memories and a souvenir. Let the lad go. You're the bigger man. You're the only actual man, as it were. So maybe it's time you. Where is Peter? Hook roared suddenly, whirling on the shadow, leveling an accusing hook at it. The thing flung itself backward in fear, but then nothing else. It didn't even shrug, which one would assume even an ignorant, badly behaved, etiquetteless shadow of an uncivilized simpleton could resort to. Hook's eyes narrowed. Maybe you don't know exactly where he is, but you have some idea. You're part of him. You even act like him. There is some sort of ley line or force that connects the two of you. If I set you free, you might even fly off yourself in search of him, lonely in your bodiless state. The thing bobbed quickly and wretchedly up and down. It tipped its head toward the small porthole window. Let me go. It was obviously pleading. Aha! Hook said triumphantly. You do have some idea. The direction at least. Now that the two of you are both back in Neverland. You can somehow sense where he is. You couldn't even when you were trapped in London. Almost like a compass, Mr. C said whimsically, chuckling from deep within his large belly. Always pointing north in a matter of speaking. Always pointing. What? Hook blinked. Almost like a compass, you say? He rubbed his chin thoughtfully. Now that, Mr. Smee, is an interesting idea. Man, poor, man torturing a poor shadow. God dang. All right, chapter 12. I don't even know how to say that word. What the heck is this? Pernicious? Whatever that word is. Pixies. Wendy stumbled backward. She wasn't hit hard enough to fall down, but the tiny points of the fairy's feet, fingers, head, stinger jabbed her right in the middle of her rib cage, knocking the wind out of her. It would probably leave a nasty bruise. She, she warily regarded her attacker. The fairy, again, Wendy assumed, was an angry, tinkling ball of light with the prettiest girl imaginable inside. Diminutive, but solid. with a scandalous lack of decorous dress. All she wore was a ragged green shift which barely covered her hips and thighs and breast, and was gathered dangerously over only one shoulder. This was both shocking and delightful. It made the tiny creature resemble statues of ancient nymphs and nereids. I think that's it. Wendy had seen. Her hair was even done up in a classical style, a goddess-like bun of hair so golden it glowed. Tiny pointed ears curved their way through the few dangling tresses. Her eyes were enormous, and not even remotely human. They were far apart and glaring. Did she just call this fairy looking like a fish? She did she really just say this fairy looks like a fish? Barbara. Oh. The crowning glory was, of course, a pair of delicate iridescent wings sprouting from her back. Their shape was somewhere between butterfly and dragonfly. They were clear as glass and thin as onion skin. The fairy chimed and jingled angrily, shedding little sparkles of golden light that danced for a little bit in the air before drifting down to the ground and fading. Wendy couldn't tell where the girl's lovely twinkling sound was coming from exactly. At first, she thought it was bells on the tiny shoes, but close inspection revealed nothing. The chimes, like the dust, seemed to come from her very essence. "Oh my, I'm so sorry," Wendy breathed, apologizing for her standing being in the way of the beautiful little thing. "Are you all right?" The twinkling grew more insistent. The fairy bobbed up and down in the air and bowled her tiny hands into fists. She aimed herself at Wendy's chest again and struck her. Prepared as she was for it this time, the pain was no worse than a bumblebee accidentally knocking into her, then buzzing drowsily off into the sunlight. "Whatever is the matter?" Wendy asked patiently. "Have I done something wrong? Will you tell me?" Luna barked once, 4 feet planted firmly and defensively. The fairy suddenly dipped down to the ground, the light emanating from her dimmed. "What is it?" The fairy stamped into the dirt and pointed at it. "Am I trampling your flower?" Wendy asked, stepping back carefully and examining the prints where she had just stood. There was no crushed petals there, just some grass and sand. No dead insects either. The fairy gritted her teeth in frustration and flew back up to Wendy. She grabbed a lock of her hair and yanked, hoisting it over her shoulder like the heaviest rope on a ship. "Ow! Hey! What is it? You merely have to tell me!" Wendy cried, stumbling farther into the clearing, trying to free her hair from the pixie's grasp. Excuse me. Apparently satisfied, the creature released her grip and dove back down to the ground, and walked, slowly and carefully, out over the ground alone. "My shadow," Wendy said slowly. A sinking feeling came over her. Her shadow crossed her arms knowingly. "Not my shadow, of course," Wendy said, biting her lip. "Peter Pan's shadow." The fairy nodded twice, slowly and solidly. No misinterpretation possible. Wendy sighed. The time of reckoning had come far sooner than she expected. She had hoped for a little more time in Neverland before her choices caught up with her. How did this fairy even know about it? Really? Wendy thought she would only have to apologize to Peter, not anyone else. Of course, she also rather hoped that the imminent doom of Neverland would overshadow any mistakes or transgressions on her part. "I don't have it anymore." The fairy's eyes widened. She started to move uncertainly. Perhaps to pull Wendy's hair again? Perhaps to shrug. Why? Perhaps to make motions to get fuller explanation. But Wendy's guilty conscience was way ahead of her. I traded it to Captain Hook in return for my passage here, she said calmly. But Shadow did a sarcastic little curtsy, as if to say, Thank you. Now we're getting somewhere. The seconds stretched out to infinity as Wendy watched the fairy register what she had said. There's something in my mouth. What the fuck? What the fuck was that? Oh, excuse me. She could feel the tropical sun on her back, feel the breeze from the sun lift the little hairs off her forehead, smell Luna's clean but doggy fur scent as she waited for a reaction. When the fairy's eyes had widened further than it seemed possible, she dove at Wendy again, here and there and everywhere at once, pinching, pulling, yanking hair, biting. Wendy covered her face and flung herself around the clearing, trying to get away from the creature without hurting her. It was like being attacked by an angry swarm of bees or a dozen fairies at once. Oh, stop! Please! Luna leapt up and bit at the air, snapping and growling and trying to grab the annoying flying thing that was hurting her friend. As she slapped madly at the air around her, Wendy prayed that neither of them actually injured the fairy. Finally, Luna's muzzle smacked the creature hard on her tiny behind, and she went tumbling head over feet straight into a tree. She slid down it, landing in a heap among the roots. Oh no! Are you all right? Wendy cried, immediately running over despite the myriad pinches and tiny cuts she had suffered from the attack. She knelt down and cradled the stunned fairy, carefully in her hands. The fairy sat up, swaying woozily. Then she leaned over and sank her teeth into Wendy's thumb. Now stop that this instant, Wendy said sternly, gripping her a little more tightly around the middle. Let us try discussing this like civilized people. I take it you're a friend of Peter's? For yet again, this creature, this particular fairy, wasn't one she had invented in her Neverland tales, and she didn't imagine her brothers could have come up with anything like her. The tiny girl pouted and frowned and crossed her arms sullenly. It was so adorable, Wendy had to work very hard not to giggle. Well, I'm very sorry about what I did. I'm not proud of it. I messed up, she admitted. But look here, your friend Peter left his shadow in my bedroom ages ago. 4 years exact. In fact, the fairy blinked at this. Wendy couldn't be sure how intelligent the fairy was. She took quite a bit of time to process this new information, and with surprise. Yes, 4 years I've kept it safe, free from dust, awaiting Peter's return. Of course, I had every intention of giving it back. I'm not a thief, but he never returned. The fairy looked uncomfortable. Her eyes darted to the side, and she squirmed a little in Wendy's palm. For years I waited for him, Wendy continued, trying not to sound too sorrowful. She wasn't wrong, after all. Every night I told stories about him, watched the night sky for him. Then they moved me out of the nursery. Michael and John went to school. I was left all by myself, alone, and waiting. And still he never came. I grew a bit despondent then, I suppose. The boys didn't want to hear my stories anymore. If it wasn't for the shadow, I would have begun to think I had imagined every last moment of Neverland. Life was life was just so dreary and dredge. And then my parents bought me this stupid dog. Not you, Luna, she added before the wolf could even react. Luna wagged her tail happily. And then they decided to send me away to Ireland. Ireland! They only want me to settle down with some nice boy with a nice job and a nice office somewhere, or as a spinster governess in some remote location. And I don't want either of those things. Not yet, anyway. Despite her anger, the fairy made a questioning tinkle that wasn't too hard to interpret. Well, I don't know what I really want. I want to see Neverland, obviously, Wendy answered, indicating the world around them. She opened her fingers, loosening her grip on the fairy. I want adventures. I want, I don't know, other things. Certainly not to do laundry aboard a pirate ship for the rest of my life. Yes, I'm ashamed of what I did. It was a bad deed. But Peter can't have missed his shadow much, since he never came to get it. The fairy tinkled angrily at her, rising up off her palm and clenching her tiny her tiny hands, god dang, once again into tiny, adorable fist. All right, look, before you start again, two things. One, I'm perfectly willing to make amends for what I did, Wendy said, squaring her shoulders. Whatever it takes, right now. Her shadow stood up straight upon hearing this, intrigued. The fairy frowned at her suspiciously. I'm obviously serious. Also, number two, and potentially far more important, either as a result of my actions or alongside of them, Neverland is in trouble. Captain Hook seems like he means to destroy the whole island. We need to stop him and find Peter. He and his shadow are involved somehow, and I will do whatever it takes to accomplish both things. She meant it. She conjured up images in her head of all sorts of brave Englishmen and realized she couldn't think of a single face. But the idea of dying at sword point or being forced to walk the plank in a dramatic rescue attempt was somehow still easier to swallow than an eternity of serving aboard a pirate ship as a nanny and scullery maid. The fairy narrowed her eyes, obviously re-evaluating the human. Then she nodded, once, not enthusiastically. Shall we go then? Wendy asked primly. Last I saw, the pirates were headed north, of what would have been north in England, up the coast. We need to get some help to stop them, I should think. More of you fairies, perhaps? And mermaids might be helpful. Or we could arrange some sort of boat, one with cannons, I expect, and a willing crew. The fairy stamped her foot angrily, then lowered herself back down onto Wendy's hand so the big human girl could actually feel it. She shook her head. She pointed into the jungle. I'm sorry, I don't. The fairy snarled in frustration. Then she made a big show of miming the act of looking for something or someone, hand shielding her eyes from the sun, peering into the distance. She pretended to find the thing and marched very dramatically toward it. She had a whole conversation with this thing, which was now obviously a person, took him by the hand, and pretended to fly off. Then she and he either battled a small army together or succumbed to it in St. Vitus' dance. It was hard to tell which. Oh, you want to find Peter Pan first, Mindy said, suddenly realizing what it all meant. Find him, and bring him along to get his shadow back from the pirates. The fairy nodded excitedly, and for a heartbreaking second looked absolutely delighted that Wendy understood. But I don't know how much time Neverland has, and do you even know where he is? The fairy shrugged and looked exasperated, throwing her arms out to indicate all of Neverland. Wendy wondered from the way the fairy was acting if the two friends had ever been separated before this happened. In spite of her determination to save their world, Wendy was ashamed to admit her first reaction was, "No, let's not go find Peter first." Only because then she would have to tell her hero straight off that she had sold his shadow to his enemy. It was one thing to admit wrongdoing to a random fairy, but to the person you've slighted himself, well, that took a different kind of courage. Perhaps he isn't so useful right now without his shadow, she ventured. The fairy frowned and pointed again. But perhaps we should drum up some other help from against the pirates first. The fairy crossed her arms and closed her eyes haughtily, shaking her head. Oh, please, Wendy said. Even with Peter Pan, the two of us can't take on an entire pirate crew. In all my stories about Peter Pan, he fights Captain Hook man to man, not against all of them. The fairy turned her head away and sniffed. Wendy rubbed her head. She had a lot of experience cajoling people, beyond her father, at least, much less an irrational little creature like this. The thing wouldn't listen to logic or reason. But of course, she was a fairy. Why would she put up with terribly human ideas like logic and reason? Wendy thought about her mother's gentle arguments with shopkeepers when the darling account came up a bit short. Well, how about this? She said, using her best reasonable voice. Let's do go fetch Peter, but perhaps we should start with the Lost Boys. He's always with his crew, so he might be there, or they might know where he is. And if he's not there, we can see if they're interested in joining us for our big run-in with the pirates. All right? The fairy pouted and looked suspicious, as if she thought Wendy was trying to trick her somehow. But she couldn't find anything obviously wrong with what had been suggested, so she nodded, reluctantly. All right then, let's... But the fairy took off like a shot, a golden bubble that zipped high into the air and disappeared. Um, all right, Wendy repeated, uncertainly watching it go. I can't fly, she added, after another moment. The clearing was silent, except for the chirping of a single insect. It regarded Wendy through what looked like very tiny pair of spectacles. Um, I'll just walk, then, I guess. She adjusted her dress and looked at Luna. Shall we? I think I think the hangman's tree is due north of us, and a bit east. We may need to bushwhack. A pity I don't have a machete or such. Just as Wendy set foot into the shady, vaguely threatening undergrowth, there came a distant tinkling sound. The bubble of golden light tore back through the sky and stopped suddenly in front of her like a confused meteor. It hovered up and down angrily. Within the glow, the fairy tapped her foot and pointed to the sky. Excuse me. I can't fly, Wendy said politely. I will have to meet you there. It will take me rather longer than you, I should expect. The fairy looked like she was going to explode in frustration. Her face turned red, and her tiny hands became grasping, strained claws. Her shoulders rose up around her neck. Uh, sorry? Oh my god, what the heck is wrong with me? Excuse me. With a strangled cry, the fairy flew at her. Wendy threw her hands up over her face for protection. Nothing happened. When no pinches or bites occurred, she hesitantly lowered her arms. The fairy was flying in loops and swirls around her, shedding fairy dust as she went, throwing it at Wendy. Delighted, the human girl raised her arms up to fully experience what was happening. Delicate golden sparkles floated down and kissed her skin. Where they touched, Wendy felt lighter. Tiny pains she hadn't realized she felt entirely disappeared, and any weariness vanished. She felt rested, energetic, eager, and airy. Oh, fairy dust! Will this help me fly? The little fairy crossed her arms and nodded. She looked over Wendy with a oh my god, what the heck happened? With an appraising eye, perhaps seeing as perhaps seeing if she had done a good job enough. Then she nodded again, satisfied, and buzzed off into the sky. Wendy raised her arms. She felt like the wind itself. Nothing happened. All right, she said. Here I go. Did the ends of her hair lift a little, or was that just a breeze? Sparkles continued to twinkle on her arms for a bit before settling into her skin. She worried. Was there a time limit? Did the magic fade if not used properly? And with that worry, she felt the earth solidly under her heels again, her full weight bearing down on the soil. Oh, oh, oh! She cried, panicking. Don't do that! Don't think bad thoughts! I don't think the fairy dust likes that. It won't work if I think bad thoughts. I don't know what the I think I stuttered. I don't know what the fuck that was. She then had to stop herself from worrying about not flying. Because of worrying and bad thoughts, it made her head a little crazy. The fairy hovered a good 20 feet with her arms crossed and an impatient, bored look on her face. Sorry, Wendy called as brightly as she could. Never done this before. Doing my best here. The fairy rolled her eyes. Wendy winced. Nothing she did or said seemed to her or the endear her to the pretty little thing at all. She wished she could do something right immediately, the first time. The fairy dove down and grabbed Wendy's left thumb with both her hands and pulled. Wendy caught her breath, delighted by the tiny, warm touch. Luna barked. She didn't at all like the unfriendly creature coming too close to her mistress. Wendy was torn, not wanting to upset the fairy, but not wanting to upset her wolf either. Oh, it's all right, girl, Wendy said, putting her hand out for Luna. She's just trying to help. The wolf pushed her nose into Wendy's palm, licking it and forcing the hand up over her head to encourage scratching behind her ears. Wendy felt a rush of warmth and affection for this friend she only knew for dreams, who loved her so fiercely and unconditionally. She felt herself lighten. The fairy also must have felt it somehow, because at that exact moment she tugged, beating her little wings, trying to fly backward and drag the girl up. Wendy rose onto her toes. Luna barked again, less worried and more perplexed. Oh, it's working, Wendy cried. In that moment, all of Neverland became everything she had always imagined it would be. She could do anything. The sky was blue, the future full of infinite good. The fairy still held her hand, obviously trying to keep a skeptical, annoyed look on her face, but her lips moved in a strange, duck-billed twist, as if she was working very hard to keep them frowning. Her whole face had lightened, the scowling darkness removed like a storm whisked away by a whimsical, beneficent beneficent card when she impatiently rolled her eyes and twirled her fingers. It wasn't with anger this time. It was encouraging. Come on, more of that. But more of what? Wendy asked, distracted by the feeling of weightlessness. Wendy, Luna, and her own thoughts. The fairy tapped her head and pointed at the human girl and shrugged dramatically. What? I was thinking. Is that what you. Yes, it was. Well, I was thinking about flying. No, I was thinking about Luna, actually. What a good girl she is, and how wonderful it is that she loves me. Wendy's toes left the ground entirely. Oh, oh, it's happy thoughts. I see you now. They make you fly, she cried, clapping her hands. And with that, she slipped the swirly bones of the earth and rose slowly, twirling into the sky. The fairy kept one tiny hand on hers, steadying her ascent. Trees and bushes below her waved in the mild tropical breeze, like undersea plants. Wendy wasn't as terrified of the height as she had thought she might be. The change in perspective was a little thrilling, a little startling, but that was all. It was like she merely had nothing to do with the ground anymore. Luna barked. Oh, Luna, I'm all right. The fairy let go. Wendy suddenly listed to the left. It was as if the fairy were the only thing anchoring her to the sky. She thrashed wildly, making flailing swimming motions that did little to help. The earth rolled, sickening below, looming close. The fairy immediately grabbed her again. Wendy felt everything stabilize. The lightness on both sides of her evened out, and she bobbed slightly again, feeling somehow supported by the air around her. The fairy waited a moment and gave her a look. All right, are you ready? Wendy swallowed and nodded. The fairy slowly withdrew her tiny hand, drawing it across Wendy's skin until just a finger touched, and then nothing at all. Wendy remained steady this time. She laughed, out loud, like she hadn't laughed in years. Honest, billowing peals of pure joy. Her skirt swished and spread out. Gravity had no effect on her anymore. Nothing tugged at her shoulders, feet, neck, mind, ears. She was weightless, untouchable. Luna barked, but it was a bark of excitement this time. A, wow, look at us, and you, and me, and that's all great, yes, bark. Seeing this, the fairy dipped down and started to sprinkle some dust on her, but the wolf ducked neatly out of the way. She pranced back and forth, her back bending and shimmering in the sunlight. She barked again politely. No, thank you, she was obviously saying. I'll go my own way. The fairy shook her head. Who wouldn't want to fly? Silly thing. Then buzzed up to Wendy's nose and snapped her fingers imperiously. All right. Yes, yes, Wendy said, too happy to take offense. I'm coming. Forgive me, I've only flown in my dreams before. The fairy rolled her eyes and took off toward the gray mountains, more slowly this time, and Wendy spread her arms out to catch the wind. Happily followed. Ah. Straight up felt like I was about to, have a stroke. I don't know what the heck happened there. But anyway, moving on to the final chapter for today's stream. Chapter 13, The Lost Boys. Wendy followed the fairy as best she could without becoming distracted by the details of the landscape below. Some things looked exactly as she had imagined them. The savannas of Hillsdale, for instance, and the multi-level pools of the Tongle Springs. But some things were subtly different, and others entirely unrecognizable. Far to the northwest was the area she couldn't remember very well. In reality, it turned out to be a peninsula surrounded in a heavily gray and vic, vic, vicious fog. Why can I not say that? maybe it maybe it really is masked by the elements because it hasn't been described yet or used in the story, Wendy thought. To the south of that was a strange balding mound of a hill that was just crying out for an obvious name. Was it John's invention? Or Michael's? Or someone else's? And wait a moment, what about those someone else's? Other children? Besides me and Michael and John? Wendy suddenly wondered. Did they make up the whole areas of the island in their own games? Or was there any part of Neverland that was just itself, not prone to the stories and imaginations of children? Was this fairy with her a native, as it were, or the result of some little girl's dream? Maybe Wendy could get some answers once everything with Hook and the shadow was sorted. Luna ran far below them, disappearing into the jungles here and reappearing on the trail there, keeping an eye on the two flyers and barking at their shadows. Wendy's shadow waved in I ain't gonna lie, I don't know how to pronounce this word. What the? I've never seen this word before. What the heck is this? In I cannot pronounce this word. um, insuccinatly? I don't know. At her as she rippled over the treetops and clearings. The ferry was already descending toward the center of the island, which wasn't really that big, despite the very obvious non-temperate flora near the beach, where the ooh, excuse me, where the pernicious forest became solidly northern, if not quite hyperborean. There were pines and oaks with their surprisingly familiar leaf shapes that spoke of cool, moist shadows below. But these grew alongside palms and vines and exotic flowers and the like, a mishmash of ideas. Spot in the middle of this mess was a scrubby clearing that was just short of terrifying and very, very long and creepy. A giant dead tree stood in the center. Its gnarled, broken off branches and twigs were like bones grasping at the sky, as if as if the tree were still fighting its fate 100 years after its death. What looked too regular to be vines turned out, of course, to be the frayed ends of ropes and nooses, all sizes and shapes, for all sorts of necks, I suppose, Wendy said thoughtfully. The grass and weeds around the tree had been trampled into dry brown dust by unknown activity. Standing like sentinels on the cardinal points just outside the circle were other gigantic trees, but these were very much alive, almost too alive. Wendy carefully and slowly lowered herself to the ground, wobbled a bit as she went. She was hoping for a perfect, graceful landing, like a Russian ballerina in one point, but it had to settle for a mostly on 2 point flat feet stumble. She bowed forward with momentum, managing to catch herself before completely tumbling over her own head. The fairy had disappeared, presumably into the hidden hideout of the Lost Boys. Luna? Wendy called. Luna! An answering howl came from somewhere downhill and to the south. The wolf was on her way, but still far. All right, I'll see you in a bit. She made a barefoot circle of the clearing, a weight of her, the weight of her dress now feeling strange as it swished behind her legs, catching against the tiny hairs on her skin. She studied the living trees on the perimeter carefully and was quickly rewarded for her efforts. Giant knots in their trunk had suspiciously black cracks around them. Body-sized holes rose up from their roots with edges that seemed strangely smooth as if they had been polished by constant use. They're not actually hidden that well, are they? She mused. Anyone, not just clever Wendy, with an eye and a moment's thought could tell there was something off, a little and a little too frequented about the area. Did the pirates really never find Peter Pan's hideout? Had they ever actually looked? It brought to mind the idea of when a child plays hide and go seek with his mummy and tries not to giggle while posing behind something too small to adequately camouflage him, the family dog, for instance, or a small ottoman. Winnie shrugged and primly stepped through a door, feeling just a tad superior. So she was more than a bit taken aback when the floor fell away mechanically below her, and she tumbled, heels over head, down a hard and lumpy ramp. She landed on an equally hard floor, a mess of dress, hair, and sash, legs splayed and vision spinning. But she could see enough to notice a very smug-looking fairy hovering in the air above her, before her, arms crossed. Oh, I'm really here. This is Peter Pan's hideout. And yours too, Wendy added quickly, just as the fairy began to frown. The place was as delightful as she had imagined. The cave under the hangman's tree was perfectly dry and smelled mostly fresh, with only the very slight tang of dirty little boys. The ground was even, and, if not neatly swept, then at least covered with an assortment of skins and rugs. One particularly large sheepskin near the fire pit had its soft and thick fleece turned upward, showing indentations where it was obviously slept on. Other beds were stashed willy-nilly around the cave, some nestled into hollows made in the walls themselves, some in the cradling arms of gigantic roots that stuck through the ceiling, some with hammocks hanging from those same roots. There were a few civilized details, like chairs that looked as though they had been purloined from more modern and elegant domiciles, a red velvet recliner, for instance, which would have been far more at home at Mr. Darling's club than a cave. Wherever did that come from? Wendy wondered. But the rest of the furniture consisted primarily of things like barrels cut in half with moss for cushions, and the stumps of trees with hastily hammered on backs, enormous mushrooms made for tables. Some of the lanterns were fungus as well, softly glowing bluish green flowers that spread in delicate clumps just below the ceiling. John would just have a field day with those, I'm certain, Wendy said with a smile. One large barrel was placed under the end of a hollowed-out root to collect rainwater. There were shelves and nooks for the few possessions considered precious by the lost boys. Piles of gold coins, interesting animal skeletons, shiny crystals, captivating birds, and seed pods. Also more strange detritus of the civilized world. A hinge, a pipe, a knob from a drawer, a spanner, and even a pocket watch. Oh, this is all amazing! Not that it couldn't do with a bit of a woman's touch. A proper cauldron could be hung from a chain built a fire for soups and stews, for instance. The rugs could be beaten out a bit. Where was the wash tub? And the out of place ornate gold frame that cleverly delineated a window. Oh, excuse me. I don't know what's wrong with me this morning. Could have used a nice little chintz curtain to keep bright light and prying eyes out. Oh, she could do so much with it. Imagine if it were hers, and all the lost boys too. She would take care of them, like young pirates. Minnie struggled with that thought. In many of her stories about Neverland, she kept house for Peter and them much like Snow White for the dwarfs, and they revered her and promised to never leave her, and always brought back the best little trinkets from their adventures. An inquisitive twinkling about her brought her out of her reverie. I don't know where they are, Wendy answered, thinking she had guessed the question, but I'm sure they'll be back soon. An irritated swoop, the fairy grabbed one of her locks and pulled, flying to the far corner of the cave, forcing Wendy to stumble quickly after to avoid any pain. You don't have to. Oh! The fairy let her go and pulled aside a piece of bright gold and pink silk hanging on the wall. Behind it was the I almost said pirates. The fairy's own private room. She had a soft bed of bright green moss with several iridescent feathers for a counterpane. A, self, a shelf mushroom served as an actual shelf displaying an assortment of dried flowers and pretty gewgaws the fairy had collected. There was a charming little dining table, somewhat bold in irony. It was the cheery but deadly red and white amanita. The white top was set with an acorn cap bowl and jingle shell charger. What the fuck is all that? I'm sorry. Excuse my language. Or don't. I don't care. In the corner, a beautifully carved, bright green leaf collected drops from somewhere in the ceiling, much like the water barrel did, but it was obviously for discreet fairy bathing. An assortment of tiny buds, rough seeds, and spongy moss were arranged neatly on a piece of gray driftwood nearby to aid in cleansing. Oh my, Wendy sighed. This is the most beautiful flat I've ever seen. The fairy tried very hard not to look pleased. The accessories, the flowers, the furniture, it's all perfect. Maybe the fairy didn't precisely blush, but she did allow the single grudgingly smile. Wendy felt her heart leap. They were, despite the fairy's initial hatred, going closer. Maybe. The caves. Suddenly, the cave resounded with bumps and knocks and disturbing echoes from above. The furniture, fairy and full-sized, shook. What's that? Wendy cried. Are we being attacked? The fairy rolled her eyes, once again dismissive of her human companion. As the first boy's body tumbled into view, Wendy understood. The lost boys were home. They came flying down the tunnel's sides, landing neatly and unfurled like ferns or strange creatures. These were the lads Peter had rescued from orphanages and terrible fate of growing up. In her stories, Wendy also had them wearing the skins of animals. And so they did, sort of. The first boy definitely had on a real bear skin, as real as the rug on the floor, and the animal's claws were worn over his hand like gloves. The next one, the tallest, had on the tail of a fox, but he also but he also sported the bright red coat of a traveling cell person and a red felt hat beaten into peaks to resemble fox ears. Excuse me. There was also a set of twins with black gloves and black masks, plastered directly onto their faces somehow. They also had puffy striped tails affixated to their gray baggy overalls, which they wore with no shirts on underneath. Scandalous, like poor street ruffians. Wendy searched her mind for what animal they could possibly be, and finally came up with raccoon, a creature from the Americas that was supposed to be terribly smart and devious, but quite prim, habituated to washing his hands in food before dining. The smallest lost boy was no more than a toddler. He also wore real fur, a beautiful black and white hide with a strangely pungent but not entirely unpleasant smell. Another New World creature, a skunk. They could spray their stink in acidic streams to deter predators. Very useful for defense. For, very useful defense for one so small and helpless. Wendy found herself thinking. Right in the middle of the group, neither the tallest nor the shortest, not the fattest or the skinniest, was an approximation of something that was not quite a rabbit. A long, very used dove gray coat, had an equally long black tail with a white tip on the end. The leather headband that held back short brown hair sported two long, floppy gray ears. Oh, hello, Wendy said, clapping her hands together in delight at all of them. They looked up at her with a little surprise, but not much more. A shadow hung over them and in their eyes. Who's this Tinkerbell? The tall fox asked. The fairy flew down in between them and twinkled and jangled. A Wendy? What's a Wendy? Oh, she is? The Wendy. I get it. While Wendy was pleased with this introduction, she felt a little slighted. She had loved fairies, always loved fairies. But how come the Lost Boys could understand what the fairy said, and she couldn't? And they even knew her name. Pleased to meet you, Wendy said, very properly, holding out her hand. The fox looked at it. Slightly, he said. He couldn't have been more than 15, but there was something in his eyes that seemed both older and younger. I'm the leader when Peter's not around. This is Skipper. He gestured at the rabbit thing, who looked away. And these are the twins. The two raccoons bobbed their heads and grinned. How'd do? Wendy grinned, charmed by the way they acted in perfect unison. Cubby, the bear bowed and growled. He pointed at the littlest one, standing next to him. This is Toodles. He doesn't talk much. He's a baby. But, a fierce baby. Don't scrap with him. The skunk had started to look annoyed and sulky, but then smiled broadly, easily lulled by quick thought words of praise. How do you do? Wendy said, leaning forward to the little skunk. His smell was actually less offensive than what was coming off of the other ones. She had to resist the urge to crinkle her nose or hide behind a scented glove, which she didn't have anyway. Slightly seemed to be the only one who bathed at all. His dark skin was free from the permanent layer of grubbiness that covered the rest of them. As with the pirates, Wendy desperately wanted to scrub them with a nice boar-bristled brush, starting with the fierce baby. Toodles melted under her attention, practically swooning. What you doing here, the Wendy? Cubby asked, displaying a set of teeth pocketed by the occasional absent baby tooth. I'm here because, well, any internal struggle she had about confessing her use of Peter's shadow and handing it over to the pirates was immediately cut short as Tinkerbell dove in, literally and figuratively, bouncing up and down and angrily shedding sparkles as she obviously told what she thought was a tale of betrayal and near murder. Slightly nodded and said, uh-huh. madly understanding everything the fairy jingled. "Oh, so that's what happened to his shadow," was all he said when she finished. Then he collapsed contemplatively onto a giant mushroom chair that bowed a little under his weight. Wendy tried to stave off her anxiety while waiting for his reaction, conclusion, or decision by running her hands through Toodle's wispy hair. Meanwhile, Skipper kept staring at her, unblinkingly, either in awe or disgust. "But wait," Wendy said, frowning. Finally said, frowning. "There's one part of your story I didn't get, Tink. This shadow was in London the whole time, and he never thought to look there?" The fairy began to sway back and forth in the air, her face twisted like a child's between contrived innocence and a brow furrowed in deep thought as she desperately tried to come up with a better answer. "Oh, Tink," Slightly said, shaking his head. "Did you keep him from going back? Were you jealous of the Wendy?" "It's just Wendy," Wendy corrected, unable to stop herself, even as she processed this new information. She looked at the fairy in shock. The pretty thing had been jealous? Of Wendy? The plain, boring London girl living with her brothers in a nursery, inventing tales of a world more wonderful than their own. Tinkerbell had Peter Pan himself. All Wendy had were stories and his shadow. And the fairy was jealous? But why? Slightly pressed, echoing Wendy's thoughts precisely. The fairy looked taken aback by this honest question. Then she stuck out her tongue at Wendy, put her hands on her hips, and turned away, fluttering her wings provokingly and buzzing. Skipper shook his head in acute disgust. "She says it was stupid the way he always made her go to London and sit outside her window," Slightly translated, "and then force her to listen to you, the ugly Wendy, tell long and boring stories of her friend." "Oh dear," Wendy said, unable to think of anything else. "They'll stink. They'll stink," the fox boy said with a sigh. "No one gets between her and Peter." "But I wasn't. I, I didn't. I couldn't even." "Oh, don't worry about it. She'll come around," Cubby said, rolling his eyes. "Girls." "Oh, there is so much I must make up for in Neverland, and I haven't been here a day," Wendy cried. "Starting with you lost boys. Slightly. I am deeply sorry for what I have done. Trading in Peter Pan's shadow for passage to Neverland was a base, cowardly thing to do." "What?" Slightly, and all the other lost boys looked at her in surprise. "Why are you sorry? Wasn't no other way you could get here. Grown-ups ain't allowed." "Pretty clever, really. Besides, pirates, you know. Hook was the one that tricked you. They're the bad guys. They're always scheming to get Peter." "So you forgive me?" Mindy asked timidly. "I guess it's Peter. Peter's got to do that. You should, probably talk to him." Slightly asked, but he seemed uncomfortable saying it. He looked over at Skipper, who looked away. "What? What's going on?" Wendy demanded. "Something is going on you're not telling me." "It ain't nothing. It ain't nothing," Skipper murmured. "It's just that no one's really talked to Peter since he lost his shadow," the twin said. "He's been really ornery, gotten way worse lately," Chubby said, rolling his eyes. "No fun at all. Him and Slightly been going at it. going at it?" Wendy asked in short. "You've been fighting with Peter Pan, your leader." "Peter said it's time for Slightly to get out of Neverland." "Because he was growing up," the twin said quietly. The rest of the Lost Boys looked embarrassed, like it was something they'd rather die than reveal to an outsider. Slightly frowned and worked his jaw, rapping his fingers on the table in nervous anger. He did. He said I was growing up, and there wasn't no place for me here anymore." "But that's unheard of. No one gets kicked out of the Lost Boys. Why? Why did he say that? Was it anything you did at all?" The Fox Boy shifted in his chair, and then suddenly leapt up, going to look out the window. "I was just getting sick of it. You know, I've been here the longest. Done it all. Go hunting, talk to the mermaids, battle the pirates, raid the licht, get raided by the licht, tease the Cyclops. It's always the same things." He begun to miss things, Cubby whispered, like it was too awful to mention aloud. "He thinks he can remember his mother. He misses beds and hard things and nurses and being indoors all the time," the twin said in disgust. "I don't ever," Slightly swore, spinning around. "I don't want any of those things. I want different things, new things. Iron and maybe a bed. So what's wrong with that? I just had some ideas about things we could do, and Peter just laughed at them." "You look like a mother," Toodles ventured, tugging on Wendy's skirt. The Lost Boys looked at him in surprise. "Oh, why, thank you, darling," Wendy said, scooping him up, reminding herself to wash her hands thoroughly as soon as she had a chance. Oh my God, this girl, this girl has no chill. This girl's rude. The skunk boy snuggled into her soft chest. "So, because of this, he threatened to throw you out." "Peter don't like change," Slightly said, scowling. "Anything different, unless it's a newer, better game that he thought up, is growing up. And bad. So I'm bad. And I'm growing up. So I have to go." "And do all of you agree?" Wendy asked, shifting Tootles onto her hip so she could turn and look each one of the Lost Boys in the eye. None of them met that look. "No," Skipper finally said, eyes to the ground. "Me love Slightly." Noodles. I said noodles. Bro, I'm hungry. Toodles murmured. "He's all we got when Peter's not around," Cubby said. "He's good. He's a good leader," the twin said. "Well, I don't suppose it's entirely up to Peter then, is it?" Wendy said. "Is he the king of Neverland?" "No, no one is," Slightly swore. "That's the whole point, right? No growing up, and no rules, and whatever you want, and fun all the time. If you want fun," he added thoughtfully. "I don't always want fun, and don't freedom mean you get to do what you want, at least sometimes?" "Absolutely correct." "Well, all right then. You will stay if you so desire," Wendy said, carefully putting Toodles back down. "That's all sorted? No one is the boss of you here?" "That's it," Wendy asked, surprised. Wendy nodded. Cubby asked, surprised. Wendy nodded. "Why not? It's Neverland. Do as thou wilt. Isn't that the whole of the law here?" "Huh?" Wendy Skipper said thoughtfully. I don't think it's quite that simple, Slightly said. At least not between Peter and me. Well, I don't think there's much I could do there. The two of you will need to work things out on your own, just as I need to apologize to him myself. Tinkerbell and I are actually here trying to find Peter and help him get his shadow back, which may ameliorate his mood a bit and tone down the tension in your little. What is it saying? Tit, I don't know what the heck is that. Thank you. Ameliorate. Uh, Tito, what? You memorize a dictionary or something? Slightly scoffed, waving his hand at her. Oh, who would want to go back to London? Who indeed? Wendy said dryly. But listen, besides having Peter's shadow, Book also has something terrible up his sleeve for all of Neverland. Deadly, and rather permanent, as he said. What? Like destroying all of Neverland? Skipper asked. Tinkerbell nodded. But why? Slightly demanded. I have some theories, Wendy said, but I think it's mostly because he's mad. Anyway, we need to stop him, and I don't think we can defeat the pirates on our own. Just the three of us, me and Tinkerbell and Peter. Even with Peter reunited with his shadow, can we count on you? The fairy rolled her eyes and turned her head away with a sniff. Aye, of course, Slightly said, sticking out his chin. Whatever my beef with Peter is, a man needs his shadow. Of course we'll go with him to get the pirates and save Neverland. That's the spirit, Slightly, Cubby cried. We'll show those stupid pirates and that stupid Captain Hook, the twins crowed. Wonderful, Wendy said warmly. Everything was coming together. She had met the Lost Boys, rallied them to her cause, and now they would come with her. And of course, the fairy, Tinkerbell, couldn't object. It would be like trying to resist a cheery force of nature, a good-willed waterfall, once they decided to come along. So, where do you think Peter is? Sometimes, when he's down, he goes to Mermaid Lagoon, Cubby said, rolling his eyes. Talks with the fish girls. Aye, I tried there first, Slightly said, nodding. Wendy tried to quell the quick thumping of her heart. Mermaids! First she got to see her fairy, who admittedly was much more hostile than she had imagined. But Wendy was working on that. And now mermaids! With glittery scales and flowing hair, everything was turning out so wonderful. So wonderfully. All right, then lead the way. Uh, well, you go on ahead, Slightly suggested. We'll just wait until you bring him up to speed. Once you tell him about what you did and where his shadow is, give him some time to, you know, react to that. He might be very angry, Cubby said, nodding. Or very happy, one of the twins said. Too very happy, the other added. He might fly off and go by himself, Skipper mumbled. Or fly off the handle right at you, or Tink, or Slightly even. The fox boy nodded. I don't know how he'll take all this news. You tell him. Let him work it out for a bit. Don't want him taking anything out on me because he ain't got his head on straight. He's swole enough as it is. He's sore enough as it is. But together, we can convince him or argue with him and be ready to immediately get the pirates, Wendy said desperately. Power in numbers. Do as thou wilt, Slightly quoted back at her. We wilt, and not until Peter's all right with all of this. And all of us. All of us sounds like a terrible idea, Wendy said forlornly, but the little fairy smiled, looking more than a touch smug. Okay, and that's the end of chapter 13. I am done reading for this session, mainly because my hand hurts and I cannot find my bookmark. Woo! That is the end. Thank you for, I don't know, all watch this and or join the stream. I can see I only have one person join the stream or look at the stream. But it's fine. Anyways, like I said before, thank you all for watching, listening. It's early in the morning for me. I'm not usually up this early. But I will see you all next time. Maybe tomorrow, maybe not. I'm not sure yet.